Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We have 4 weeks between now and Pesach, and I'm really trying to knock off this one unit, which is what we call limited theism. So we're going to do 2 sessions now on Rabbi Harold Schulweis, then 2 sessions on Harold Kushner. We did Milton Steinberg. We talked about, I will give a very brief introduction to catch people up, the concept of limited theism. These are all 3 disciples of Kaplan who basically believe in God but express God's role in the world, or believe in a supernatural deity but talk about God's role in the world in a limited way. So God is not responsible when someone gets sick and dies. God is not responsible for allowing the Shoah to happen, etc., etc. And then, of course, this leads to the question of, okay, well, if you don't believe in God's omnipotence, then what's the point of a belief in God, and why do you pray? So those have to be corollary questions, okay? So we're moving on to our very own local Rabbi Harold Schulweis Zal. And I went over my Schulweis readings there. You can see it, right? You can see something on the screen? Yes? Someone nod. Okay. And I couldn't find a natural stopping point. So I'm going to try to get through this in this week and next week. And I'm not sure where we're going to stop this week other than about 8:45. It may be in the middle of something. Okay, so a big part of what Rabbi Schulweis talks about, he coins a term, you don't have to know these terms, like limited theism. Someone who wrote a book made up this term, limited theism. So Rabbi Schulweis made up this term, predicate theology. And I thought, does that actually illuminate anything, or is that just another obscure term? So we'll see what he means by that. So he starts out saying, I go and talk to college students. And when I talk to college students, we're near the bottom of page 147. I'll enlarge it a bit. When I talk to college students, near the bottom of the page, I've noted an interesting response to 2 ways of formulating the God idea. In one form, I ask these college students, when he speaks, how many could subscribe to the belief that God is just, merciful, good, that it is God who uplifts the fallen, heals the sick, and loosens the fetters of the bound, right? So I go to college audiences and I say, how many of you think that God heals the sick and uplifts the fallen and is just merciful and good? And he says this question is generally met with reluctance, at best with agnostic reserve, and frequently with strong denial, which means college students in his audiences say, well, I don't know that you could say that about God, or, I don't know that I believe that, or, I don't believe that. But then he says, I asked them, the other formulation asks, how many of you in the college student audience would affirm that justice, mercy, and goodness are godly, that uplifting the fallen, healing the sick, and loosening the fetters of the bound are divine? Here the response is largely positive and most often enthusiastic. Okay? And he makes a distinction here between subject God is a subject, meaning how many people of you would believe that God does X, Y, or Z? Subject God means God is the subject of the sentence. God makes a miracle. God heals the sick. That's God as subject. All right? And he contrasts this with divine. Notice God is capitalized and divine is lowercase. Notice also over here, godly is lowercase. Divine is lowercase, okay? So, and divine predicates, you have to think back to, when they made you diagram sentences, and whenever they did that, 8th grade or 10th grade, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure they don't do that anymore in school, right? But the predicate meaning, this act is godly, okay? You go do Bikur Cholim, you did something godly. You take a walk around the block with Roberta and Debbie as they're getting up from Shiva. You're doing something, you're comforting the mourners. This is godly. So what he says is, modern people, I'm going to reframe what he just said, modern people really tend not to buy into this idea that God does things. God is subject, but what does appeal to them is the idea that God as predicate, meaning that there are certain things that are godly. He should say not just predicate, adjective, right? God is noun versus God is adjective. I think that's how I might reframe it. He calls it subject God versus predicate. And he says, oh, is it my job as a rabbi to convince people of God as the subject? Is that my job? It's a rhetorical question, right? End of this paragraph on the top half of page 148. Is the theological task to encourage faith in the subject or to elicit faith in the predicates? Which is more important, religious, morally, and liturgically? To endorse faith in the who or the what of divinity? The who. He contrasts that. I missed it. The who or the what? Fidelity to Elohim or Elohut? Elohut is an adjective, which means godliness. Okay? He says, really, is it really my job, the theologian, my job to convince people of the who? Or is it my job to work with people of the what? Okay, the what is godliness? Is it about Elohim, God, or Elohut? Hebrew, because of how Hebrew can be conjugated and declined, it's the nice way of saying God or godly. And what difference does there appear to be in the minds of those who are willing to affirm, A, that which heals the sick is godly, while denying, B, that it is God who heals the sick? So here's where here's what Kaplan would say. Okay? Kaplan would say healing the sick is godly, but what godly means is the highest human moral aspirations, moral and spiritual aspirations, and that there is no subject. There is no supernatural deity. Schulweis does not say that. He says, modern people do not intuitively buy into that idea that there's a supernatural deity, and I'm not that interested in working to convince them of that. That's not so important to me, because where they're at is they do believe in Elohut. They do believe in godliness. They do believe that certain acts that humans do are godly and divine. And that's where I'm interested in working. He doesn't say that there is no who, which is what Kaplan says. Okay? Kaplan in the wake of Freud. Right? Kaplan is a truly post-traditional thinker. And this is where these people are limited theists. All right? So he doesn't say there is no God. He just says, people don't buy that, and that's not all that important to me. Why? What is this thing about godliness? Why is that important? Imitation of godliness on 152, where I've marked the margin. In Judaism, the essential test for us as human beings is living our lives in a way that makes manifest the attributes of godliness. As one rabbinic sage asks, this passage, how is it possible for a fallible mortal human being to fulfill the mandate to walk in God's way, seeing that God is described as a devouring fire, right? Midrash says, the Torah says, God says, walk in my ways. The Midrash says, well, how can we walk in God's ways? What does that mean? How can the finite soul emulate the mysterious essence of divinity? It is not the face, but the back of God that is imitated. We just read in Parshat Ki Tisa, this Shabbos, right? Hashem says to Moses, you can't see my face. No one can really know my true essence. You'll see my back, which is sometimes interpreted metaphorically as you'll see the results of my actions. It is not the penetration of the secrets of God's essence that is the goal, but the observed consequences of God's moral behavior that is the path to God. God informed Moshe, I will take away my hand and you will see my back, but my face you will not see. God is imageless, right? But God's ways are discernible and emulatable. And there's a later mention where he says, I can't remember where, we might get to it, where he basically says, well, we can't know what God is. In Torah terms, God is a consuming fire. In Rambam's terms, God is an fundamentally unknowable intelligence that is unlike anything else known to humans. So we can't really know anything about capital S subject God anyway. So who cares if modern people aren't interested in it? Everyone follow that? We can't know anything anyway. Rambam said, oh, we can't know anything anyway, but you try to meditate, as it were, contemplate, intellectually, use your intelligence to try to get as close to God as possible. And Schulweis is saying it doesn't matter that God is inscrutable. Sorry, it doesn't matter that people aren't interested in God, in what is God, because God is inscrutable anyway. Okay? What matters is, and people do agree to this, that there are certain things that commonly people say, oh, that's a godly act. Okay? And what are those things? Those things, again, this is where he wants to ground it in traditional Jewish theology. And it's not, I'm making this up as a modern. He grounds it in traditional Jewish theology by saying, this is what we're told, to be divine, to try to walk in God's ways, is to act in certain ways. And here he says near the bottom of the page, God clothed Adam and Eve because they were naked. God visited Abraham when he was sick. Okay? As God clothed the naked, so do thou. As God visited the sick, do thou also. God comforted Yitzchak after the death of Abraham. As God comforted the bereaved, do thou also. God buried Moses in the valley. As God attended to the deceased, do thou also. Right from the Talmud. Meaning, the point of being Jewish is not to contemplate and try to understand the inscrutable. Therefore, says Schulweis, I don't really care if you aren't interested in the inscrutable. I don't really care if you don't believe in God the subject. Okay? The essence of Judaism is to act in a godly way. Notice these are all mitzvot of what we would call acts of chesed, interpersonal mitzvot. And we are told by our tradition, that's what it means to be godly, is to do these things. Top paragraph on page 153. We're going to do a little bit more. Where am I? Near the top of 153. God is verified or made true in our lives, not by syllogistic argument or the declaration of dogmas, which means I can prove to you that God exists. It's important for you to believe that God exists. It's important for you to believe that God is X, Y, or Z. He says, no. That is not how God is verified in our lives, but rather by acting out the accessible attributes of divinity. The gift of imago Dei, the image of God, pulls us toward imitatio Dei, the lived imitation of God. Belief in God's reality and goodness is behave. So he is saying, being a good Jew, a loyal follower of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is not about what you believe, but how you behave. And he says, when I speak back to the beginning of our passage, when I speak to contemporary audiences, they're not so interested in what God is. They are interested in how to behave, right? So they're not interested in what is the divine with a capital D. They are interested in what acts are divine with a lowercase d. The image of God, shadowed in the human being, implies a special closeness with God, a unique human collegiality with the divine. Acknowledging the gift of the image, the human being is elevated as a partner with God in sustaining and transforming the self and its environment. The internalized image, capital I, bears testimony to the divine human resemblance, a shared moral affinity. To become aware of the ideal image of divinity within us is to become conscious of human power and human responsibility. I wrote in the margin, not equal Kaplan, right? Kaplan would say, this is not about a partnership. This is about our projection, okay? A projection of the highest human impulses, which we label this fictional thing God. And Kaplan says, no, it is a partnership between us and God.
Schulweis.
It is the highest human expression of spirituality, morality, etc. Okay, but that is because
you said Mr. Kaplan. You meant Schulweis.
no, I meant not equal Kaplan. I'm
Right,
sorry.
but you said
Okay, Kaplan would say thank you. Kaplan would say it's a projection outward of human stuff. Okay, Schulweis says no, it's a partnership, and the reason we have that highest aspirations is because we are in the image of God. Now, that's his belief in his theology, and therefore we have a unique human collegiality with the divine. What does unique mean? It means dogs don't have that collegiality with the divine. Flowers don't have that collegiality with the divine. Rocks don't have that collegiality with the divine. Humans have that we uniquely have that human collegiality with the divine, right? That's what it means to be, he says later on, in the image of God. Bitzalmein na'aseh Adam bitzalmenu kidmutenu. Let's make human beings in our image. Genesis chapter 1. So the reason we're like that, says Schulweis, is because we have stamped into us, the very fiber of our being, the image of God as subject who exists. I don't really care if you believe that or not, though, is what he is saying. It's not that important. As long as you accept, again, what he calls earlier, the predicate theology. These are the things that are godly. I'll read a little bit more about this. That big paragraph at the bottom of page 153. The Jewish insistence on the interdependence of divinity and humanity encourages the creative involvement of the self in God's universe. Consider Genesis, right? God had not yet caused it to rain upon the earth, and there's no human to till the soil. The connection of the falling rain from heaven and the human tilling of the earth symbolizes the significance of human divine interdependence. He goes on later on to say something about hamotzi. Is it here? Somewhere else he says hamotzi, right? Hamotzi lech amin haaretz. God does not cause bread to come out of the earth, right? God causes the conditions for things to grow, okay? And then humans cultivate the earth, till the soil, harvest the stuff, grind it up, mix it with water, put it in an oven, and make it into bread. That is our partnership with God. Here's the difference between Kaplan and Schulweis. I just want to highlight it again. Kaplan would say, oh, that's nature, okay? And human beings do something with nature. And Schulweis would say, no, nature comes from God, okay? Nature is science, and science comes from divinity. And we are partners with divinity. Okay, so I hope everyone gets that distinction. I'm going to stop now before we get to, so what does this have to do with prayer? Okay, so I want to pause for a few minutes of comments or questions. Is it clear? Does it seem clear? Larry?
Larry and Diane today.
Larry and Diane today.
In your description this morning, you have perfectly demarcated the difference between Diane and me.
Oh.
I remain a Kaplanist.
One of you will dress up as Kaplan next Purim, and one of you will dress up as Schulweis.
And she's a Schulweisian. It's exactly the case.
Got it. And he would say, again, Schulweis would say, by the way, we'll read next week selections from a sermon he gave a couple of decades ago about, so why a guy who comes to him and says, I don't believe in God, so why should I pray? Right? So he will end up making an argument, though, that it doesn't matter as long as you both agree on what it means to act in a divine way. And he will say, oh, if you're interested in coming and talking to me about theology, we can talk about what I believe about there being a subject and what you do or don't believe. Okay? But we're both working at the soup kitchen, feeding the hungry. I think that's what he would say is important. But I'm glad I helped capture your mixed marriage there. Okay. Carl.
So I want to note that the examples that appeared in the text of godly behavior
Yes.
were all kind of on the nice guy side. And there are other examples of godly behavior, like smiting bad people and visiting the sins of the father under the children that we have to be conscious of too. And is it being godly to do those things?
So I think he would say that a living tradition, a faith tradition, means living with interpretations of received tradition. And part of living with those interpretations means that we're part of a community that has leadership, which is to say educated interpreters. They know the Talmud better than I do. Okay. And that I'm now speaking for him, and I don't know if we could find something in his writings that says this, and that living faith communities need to choose very carefully which interpretations they follow. And, and by the way, and if we could step outside of the Jewish argument, just about all faith traditions of which I am aware, just about all, I don't know, maybe Jains, different, but most of the world faith traditions of which I am aware have something in their tradition somewhere which says, kill all the infidels, and something in their tradition somewhere that says, be kind to every creature because every creature is a creature of God. So it's all, if you were a, I don't know, historian of the phenomenology of religious communities or something like that, I think you would say, yeah, it's always due for living communities to whose interpretations you follow. So, we say, there are those people who say, oh, certain enemies of Israel are Amalek, so we should kill them. Right there, we're commanded to wipe out Amalek because we're commanded to do that in the Torah. And other people say, we have clear sources in the Talmud and medieval which say that all the nations of the world are mixed up, historically, this is a historical thing, and therefore we have no way of identifying who is Amalek or who are the 7 nations of Canaan, and therefore those commandments are null and void in our time because we do not know who is the seed of Amalek, right? So which halacha do you decide to follow? Which rabbis do you decide to follow? I think an observer of religious development would say in any religious tradition, it's always up to which interpretations does the community choose to follow.
I didn't want to get stuck on schmeicing the bad guys.
Okay.
My point, I guess, is more that being godly is not equal to being nice. It's complicated. We need justice in the world. We occasionally have to punish bad behavior in order to be godly.
He doesn't say anything about nice, right? He's talking about social mitzvot, right? And there's nothing that's right. And I'm sure he would agree that there are, I don't think he would disagree with the statement of there needs to be justice and fairness in the world. And he would say, clothing the naked isn't being nice. It's being divine.
So we'll accept the postulation that being godly is desirable.
Yeah.
Now we need to get on with figuring out what does being godly mean in everyday life.
And who will help us. And again, part of Judaism is, this is where contemporary, I'm going to call it contemporary non-Orthodox Judaism is very different than traditional Judaism, because contemporary non-Orthodox Judaism is about, I read the tradition and I decide what resonates with me. whereas traditional Judaism has always said we rely on authorities of our community to help us interpret what is authoritative.
And we have a pretty elaborate exposition of what is good behavior. We got 613 examples.
Correct. But we have also a tradition of 2,000 years of interpreting those 613 examples. And I am not as expert as someone else who is more learned as me. And, there's been a debate. Well, it's a small debate about, the what's called, quote unquote, the modern religious group in Israel, meaning the non-Haredi, non-ultra-Orthodox group in Israel, and how many of them have become yoked to, I'm going to get in trouble, to the more nationalistic, militaristic, political right wing in Israel. And there is a group, by the way, called Hasmol HaEmuni, the Faithful Left, which are Orthodox lefties. They just had their second annual American conference this past Sunday in New York. And they say, well, you religious soldiers, you're asking the wrong rabbis, right? You ask your rabbi if you're allowed to do X. We have to choose carefully which rabbis we ask if I'm allowed to do X or Y. Because the traditional tradition is, should I do this or should I do that, is ask your rabbi. Yeah. And we more, I will say, liberal Jews are more affected with an A, some would say infected with the individualistic impulse of, well, I don't care what any authority says, I decide for myself, right? Which is not the traditional Jewish way of interpreting. Bernie, last question, comment, then we got to move on.
Yeah, I've attended a lot of lectures from Rabbi Feinstein, and of course, he always says Schulweis was his mentor.
Yeah.
And another person in my family was very close to the couple. And how did he get, I just don't know. I know the rabbi in San Bernardino thought he was the greatest American rabbi for decades that I knew him. How did he get so influential in the canon, so to speak, of great modern American thinkers?
It's a good question. I don't some of that has to do with his, the thoughtfulness of his thought and he wrote a lot. He spoke a lot, so some of it has to do with volume, but obviously that volume has to resonate and land with people. Okay. If someone writes a lot and speaks a lot, but no one buys into it, then they're not going to become so influential. So it's a good question. I'll let someone else come up with the answer to that maybe next time. Someone who knew Rabbi Schulweis better than I did, but it's a good question. All right, let's leave it for today. We got to stop, and we shall continue, God willing, next week with, okay, given all that, why do we pray? What's the point of praying if I don't really understand what the subject is?
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.